Hello there, Dr. Kalman Andrassy here, and I'm going to discuss how to go ahead and write up the introduction section to a research report. Now, I do want to note a couple of things in advance before I do talk about this. First and foremost, of course, I'm using my own rubric for my classes in determining what grade I should give a paper based on how well they cover certain topics in that introduction section. Secondarily, I wanted to note that one of the sections here is the statement of the hypothesis or hypotheses. Now, that is something that I actually don't use necessarily for this introduction section, and I do sometimes set that aside because a lot of people don't necessarily establish a hypothesis for their research until after they conduct their literature review, particularly as far as exploratory and oftentimes descriptive sorts of research studies. You want to kind of hold off making judgments as to what the ultimate result will be of your research question until you've had an opportunity to kind of see what the theoretical frameworks are in the literature review, so that you can make an informed decision as to what your prediction is going to be about the outcome. Okay, so that's another thing there. Um, and that's really as far as I'll kind of have a disclaimer as far as the kinds of things that may or may not be kind of covered here. But my rubrics break down what makes an expert paper, a proficient paper, an apprentice paper, and a novice paper. If you're going to be in the A category, you're going to be doing an expert level paper. Proficient would be B level, apprentice would be C level, novice would be D to F, depending on the amount of data that's actually available in that paper. Okay? So the first component of the introduction is the research problem area and the purpose of the research. Okay, so you want to establish what it is that you're ultimately doing your research on, and of course, given that it's social scientific research, it's probably going to be based on some sort of a problem that exists, right? If you're looking at sleep and GPA, the problem is that GPAs go down when people don't get enough sleep. If you're looking at what the interrelationship is between social media usage and depression levels, the problem is the depression levels of individuals based on their usage of their social media. So in conducting most social scientific research, you're probably going to be looking at some sort of a problem. Otherwise, you just want to go into the details of the purpose of your research. What is it that you're ultimately trying to do? So I'm just going to read the expert elements of these sorts of papers so that you can kind of get an idea as to what goes into each of these sections. So an expert paper would thoroughly discuss the nature of the issue being explored in an understandable manner and establish how the topic is feasible. So we go beyond just addressing what that problem is, but we also talk about how your topic is actually researchable, right? You want to be able to determine, if you'll have the time and the resources and the access to be able to complete this study. Okay, so as long as you go into that, you're pretty much golden as far as that problem area is concerned. Background information. So the paper extensively goes into detail about the background of the problem being explored, including specific facts and statistics about the number of individuals impacted and the magnitude of that impact, right? So you want to go into kind of the nitty-gritty about this problem, any specific information that you can provide related to that problem. So if there are any specific organizations that already deal with the problem, if there are if there's any information available at all about the extent to which the problem affects certain demographics more so or less than other demographics. Actually getting Any information about how many specific people are being impacted would be ideal, right? If you're doing research on some sort of a disease, if you can find any information about roughly how many people have the disease, or how many people are affected by the disease every year, or anything like that. Those are the kinds of facts and statistics that you'd want to cite in that background information section. So really, you want to address the history of the problem area. You want to discuss the history and efforts of any organizations involved, particularly any organizations that you might be doing research for. Hint, hint, wink, wink. So if you're working for organization X as an employee, and you're doing an evaluative research project, you want to talk a little bit more about that organization than you would if you're just doing sleep and GPA and there's no particular organization that you're doing that sort of research for. Okay. Next, we have the discussion of the independent and dependent variables. Again, remember, the independent variable is what affects the dependent variable, and you want to establish all of those different variables that you're going to be exploring. So the paper identifies and describes the main independent and dependent variable, as well as some other variables relevant to the topic being explored, right? And this is where you're probably going to do things like define key terms. So, you have your independent and your dependent variables, which you're going to have to define in and of themselves. But also any way in which you have to understand other terms in order to really understand what that variable is. You want to list out key terms and things like that relatively early on, after you've kind of given a bit of a background overview of what's going on with regard to the topic that you're exploring. Okay. Next, we have the statement of the hypothesis or hypotheses. Again, some individuals wait until after the literature review to establish their hypothesis. But if you already have a hypothesis, if you already have a predicted relationship or difference that you think you're going to see in the variables that you're exploring, this would be a great place to put it. So the paper states the research question and the author's hypothesis or hypotheses for the relationship between the main independent and dependent variables. The hypothesis is directional and provides a prediction of how the independent variable affects the dependent variable, right? Again, if nothing more, you're just going to posit your research question, maybe talk a little bit about that research question and all the different angles and elements that might go into it, if you're not going to be presenting a hypothesis. But having a hypothesis there is not a bad place to put it if you're going into your research with a particular kind of end goal in mind. Okay. Next, you want to discuss the topic's importance. Okay. The introduction, in many ways, is sort of like a marketing tool for your paper, right? It's the first section that people are going to read, and you want to establish that the topic that is being discussed is both interesting and important, right? So that's why you want to have this section, so that people continue to read the other 4 parts of your paper as they kind of move through. So the paper goes into the importance of the potential practical implications of studying the topic. Even if it's not an applied study, you're doing basic research, maybe think of potential ways in which the topic might be important in the future. Including but not limited to contributing to a deeper understanding of social phenomena, which is what basic research would kind of lay out. Changing behaviors, which is a key factor in applied research, or creating policy or programs and affecting legal precedent, right? All applied research sorts of things. So, the implications and the importance of the topic vary from topic to topic, and what you're ultimately going to be focusing on also will vary. But I think for most studies, even if you don't have an immediate behavior or policy changing sort of a topic, you can potentially discuss ways in which doing the research might be able to benefit some other areas in the future. Okay? And then, of course, we have spelling and grammar and citations as other major components in determining the grade of individuals. I will take off quite a few points for a lack of appropriate citations. I mean, I don't think an A paper, even if it has all the good components, I don't think a paper is an A paper without adequately citing anything that requires citation. And then, of course, with spelling and grammar, in general, I want papers to lack spelling and grammar mistakes, but I will take off points, even if there's just a couple. But if there's a lot of errors in the paper, it's going to affect the overall grade of that paper, absolutely. And I'm sure that is the way that most other professors would also deal with that situation, so I don't think I'm necessarily going off the reservation as far as that's concerned. Okay? Other things to kind of note before moving on. Academically, this is part of a 5-part research report, but you don't always have a full 5-part report depending on the professional organization you might be submitting your paper to. And a lot of organizations, as well as a lot of journals, have you kind of combine the introduction and the literature review into kind of one condensed section rather than two separate sections. And that's all well and good. I would advise everybody to learn the 5-part process simply because that's the way it's done academically, and it's always easier to combine things after the fact than it is to separate things by separating an introduction and literature review section. What else? Page lengths, right? The number of pages that this is going to take is based on your own research topic and how comprehensive you are in covering these topics, right? For my own classes, I'm usually looking at somewhere between 2 and 4 pages for the introduction most of the time. If you look at my master's thesis or my doctoral dissertation, they're like 20, 30, 40 pages for the introduction section because there's a lot of background to kind of go into. So I don't say that there is a set page requirement for really anything. If you can briefly in a page talk about all this stuff to an acceptable degree, I will give an A for that. If it takes 4 pages, that's perfectly fine too. If it takes 40 pages, hey, I don't expect anybody to do that in one of my classes, but if that's what it takes to go over all the information for your particular research project, no problem with that at all, right? So I don't usually expect somebody who writes less than 2 to 4 pages for the introduction to do necessarily as well, but I can be surprised. I can be pleasantly surprised. So that's what I'll say as far as that's concerned, and I'm sure that the same will apply to most other professors that don't have very stringent paper length requirements. Okay? So with that, go ahead and have fun preparing your introduction, really sitting down and finding out specifics and details about the research topic and the research questions that you're going to be covering. And thinking about where your research is ultimately going to go in the course of doing your study.